Before I'm going to reread a lot of the preface. I think I stumbled through it a little bit at the end of class last time when we were on the Zoom call. So, did y'all have questions? Y'all trying to find it or what? Yeah. This is not the book. This is actually a PDF on the blackboard, right? So this is the Fear and Trembling, right? So anyway, like I said, I'm going to reread this a bit and pause a little to sort of explain. I'm going to skip a lot of the quotes he's got in parentheses from Descartes. He kind of uses those, I guess, to kind of back up his claims that he's making about Descartes. But before I read it, I probably should have done this last time. In fact, I probably shouldn't even have read it last time, but I felt like, geez, I told you we're going to start Fear and Trembling, and so we should. But I probably should have done a little bit more background information to make you understand a little bit more of the point that he's making here in the preface. And to do that, I want to make this distinction. I want to make this distinction that he himself draws between, what you might call classical philosophy versus modern philosophy. I think this camera needs to probably be moved because these people watching it won't be able to see anything. All right, hopefully that's better. I don't know. Is that anybody's way? Y'all can see around it. So, in the preface, right, he loosely refers to the Greeks. And the only name we get, really, in reference to modern philosophy is Descartes. Descartes was French, so it's not pronounced Descartes, it's Descartes. French, they like to use a lot of letters without actually pronouncing them. Don't ask me why. The big, distinction that he tries to draw, and he is, Johannes de Silentio. That's the author of this work. I mean, Kierkegaard wrote it, but he's writing it as Johannes, John the Silent. Johannes de Silentio. But the big distinction that he draws is this distinction of doubt, right? That the modern philosophers kind of begin from this place of doubt. And then they all go further, right? Doubt is their starting point. And he thinks that for the Greeks, like the classical philosophers, if you look at Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics, they start from a space of wonder, right? Wonder around the world, and they work their whole life to arrive at doubt, right? Doubt is sort of seen, and we're going to read the passage where he says this, doubt is seen as the task of a lifetime, as he puts it. But now, the moderns, they all start with doubt. They all start with it. But they don't just leave it there. They don't just stop at doubt. They all go further. He keeps saying that. They go further. I did a little bit of background on Descartes last time, but it bears repeating, and I think maybe I should do a little bit of a fuller background on Descartes, because he doesn't seem to be so critical of Descartes, and honestly, I think he maybe is too charitable in his reading of Descartes in this preface. We'll go over it in a minute. But he seems to think that Descartes was a very sincere thinker, that his doubt was real, that, because he lived through the modern period, because Descartes had basically witnessed the scientific revolution, all of these things were revealed to him to be false, that he thought were absolutely true, unquestionable, things that he learned from the classical philosophers, the Aristotles, and some of the medieval scholars that kind of built upon that system. But all of a sudden, Galileo comes along, people like Galileo, people like Copernicus, all these scientists, and they reveal that all these truths were false. And they were things that were just like, geez, they're so obvious. Does the earth feel like it's moving? You're crazy if you think it's spinning. What are you, nuts? We'd be all falling, flying all over the place. Obviously, the earth is stable, it's in the center, and all those other things are moving around us. That was the logic, and they went with it for centuries. All of a sudden, bam. So the modern period begins. Descartes is often referred to as the father of modern philosophy. One of his most famous works, if you ever take Intro to Philosophy with most professors, with me for sure, we cover Descartes' Meditations. He quotes other stuff like the Principles of Philosophy to demonstrate something, but the Meditations, that's sort of his classic text. Meditations on first philosophy. And in the Meditations, he famously doubts pretty much everything. You know, he's lived through this scientific revolution. All the stuff he was taught was true, turned out to be false. He's freaking out. So he's like, how can I even know anything? And he devises this evil genius hypothesis. He tells himself, I'm going to imagine that there's an evil genius who's absolutely powerful and cunning, who's tricking me to believe things that are true when they're false. And I'm deceived about everything. So at that point, he doubts his senses. He even doubts mathematics. He doubts everything. And he says, I'm not going to proceed until I've disproven this hypothesis and I have some basis for knowing something. I gotta move on, but I'm not gonna move on till I've completely eradicated this doubt of the evil genius. And he does this through a proof of God's existence, you know, which to me is a very unconvincing proof. He offers several of them, but we cover them in my philosophy class. To be fair, most proofs for God's existence are pretty weak, or most proofs for or against. They're usually pretty, lacking. But the point is, Descartes, as the father of modern philosophy, even though the other modern philosophers that preceded after him, that came after, they started, even if they didn't disagree with him completely, they started with this sort of skeptical position. How do I know anything? All I know is that I think, therefore I am, says Descartes. My thought is undeniable. Whether I'm thinking something true or false, that's debatable. So we have to establish modes of methodology, the scientific method that's rigorous to determine whether or not something's true or false. So he kind of sets the tone for modern philosophy. So the idea is you start from doubt and skepticism. Tradition is thrown out, right? Tradition was wrong. Tradition could be completely wrong. The Greek's a little different, at least he's characterizing them differently. The earlier philosophy started with, well, of course we know things. Obviously this is true. What can we build off of this? People like Plato, right? Our mind's eye can shine light on the truth through understanding, through reason, through rationality. And doubt was something that Plato didn't arrive at till, I'm trying to do as much justice to Johannes de Silencio's interpretation as possible, but you could say that Plato arrived at doubt later in his life. When Plato was an old man and he tried out all his philosophy and then he started to see problems with it. You can read the last 4 or 5 dialogues. I wouldn't recommend reading them unless you're a total philosophy nerd. They're very technical and abstract, but they're very self-reflective and very self-critical. So again, the way that it's characterized here, the Greeks, they start with wonder and curiosity and a sort of like confidence about their knowledge of the world, and confidence that because they're rational beings and they're not just animals, they can somehow know things. And then they arrive at doubt after they've explored a little bit. This is not the way that the moderns perceive. The moderns perceive from doubt. How do I know anything at all? Could be wrong, could be a dream, could be a lie, could be the Matrix. How do I disprove it, right? Completely different attitudes. Right? Completely different attitudes. That modern attitude, by the way, is what gave us the rigorous science, the awesome technology that we have. But Kierkegaard seems to argue in this work and others that it's also taken some stuff away. And that this sort of quest for certainty, the sort of reliance on nothing but one's own self to pick oneself up out of this sort of nothingness and to construct truth from one's methodological doubt, for Kierkegaard, for Johannes de Silencio, this has left us in a sort of milieu, an environment in which passion is lacking and in which things aren't very clear. about, as far as like what's good, what's bad, what's beneficial, what's not beneficial. If you're living in the medieval period, for instance, if you're living amongst the classical Greeks, and you ask somebody the question, what is life about? What's the meaning of life? A lot of times you're going to get a pretty straightforward answer, right? Just get married, have kids. What the hell are you freaking? What's the problem? Or just go to the church if you're living during the medieval period. Father, whatever is going to tell you. And it was very simple. Maybe it wasn't as liberating as modern society. With modern society, it's sort of like, hey, you figure it out. Hey, it's up to you. You're free. Freedom. Awesome. It's not like, hey man, you're a peasant, you're going to be a peasant your whole life, be a good peasant. When you die, Jesus Christ will reward you, right? That's your only option. No other options, right? But it was pretty clear. It was like, okay, that's what it means. I guess that's all I got. What the hell? But now it's like, what does anything mean? Where do I find any meaning or significance? I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to be a slave to the Pharaoh building the pyramid, but at least I would have known what I was doing. I would be like, okay, there's this rich dude that wants to show off and I'm building the freaking pyramid for him. I know why. But some people are like, they go to work and they're like, why am I doing this? How does this contribute to anything to anybody? Feels like it's just so abstract. I'm so detached from what I do. Marx talked about this quite a bit, right? So Marx, this is interesting because Karl Marx, completely different thinker than Kierkegaard. They're writing around the same time though. Kierkegaard is writing in Denmark, Marx is mainly in France and England. But Karl Marx, the famous political philosopher, wrote the Communist Manifesto. He had a similar critique of modernity, right? He thought that you're detached from, Marx talked in economic terms, so he talked about how you were detached from your product of your labor. When you make something in a factory, at an industrial factory, you a lot of times don't even really know what you're making. You don't see the finished product. You just see that one microchip or that one little thing you do, and it's this monotonous task. I can't use my phone as an example because I'm using it to record this lecture, but think about the person who works in the factory that makes this smartphone, right? When they see that smartphone, are they like, oh, I'm so proud of my work, right? See that chip in there? They can't see the chip. It was not like the older times when if you worked in a workshop and maybe you built carriages, horse carriages or something, and you were in charge of the wheels, right? It may have been kind of a menial job, but you knew it. You see the horse carriage, like, those are the wheels I made. And you took a certain pride in it, and you saw how you fit into the whole scheme of things, how you were a significant part of society. The argument, though, is that modernity, with all its conveniences, has sort of made this it's created this environment where it's really hard to find a niche. It's really hard to find something that you're good at. And it's even when you do find something you're good at, sometimes it's kind of like, well, couldn't I be doing something better? So when he talks about this clearance sale of ideas, right? I think this is sort of part of his criticism of modernity. So let's again, this I read last time, but I feel like I need to reread it. Not just in commerce, but in the world of ideas too, our age is putting on a veritable clearance sale. So not just in commerce, not just in goods, but in actual ideas, everything is just being sold for cheap, right? It's like there's an answer for all your ills, right? There's some guru that's here to fix your problems. He says, everything can be had for so dirt cheap that one begins to wonder whether in the end anyone will want to make a bid. Every speculative scorekeeper who conscientiously marks up the momentous march of modern philosophy, every lecturer, crammer, student, everyone on the outskirts of philosophy or at its center is unwilling to stop with doubting everything. They all go further. It would perhaps be mal-apropos, out of place, to inquire where they think they are going. Though surely we may all, in all politeness and respect, take it for granted that they have indeed doubted everything. Otherwise, it would be odd to talk of going further. This preliminary step is one they have all taken, and presumably with so little effort as to feel no need to drop some word about how. For not even if someone genuinely anxious for a little enlightenment on this will find such, not a gesture that might point him in the right direction, no small dietary prescription for how to go about such a huge task. But Descartes did it, didn't he? a venerable, humble, honest thinker whose writings surely no one can read without being most deeply stirred. Descartes must have done what he has said and said what he has done, a rare enough occurrence in our time. Descartes, as he himself repeatedly insists, was no doubter in matters of faith. Yet, and then he gives a quote from Descartes, and this is true. If you read the Meditations, Descartes constantly refers to this light of his soul that tells him what is true, right? There's this light in my soul that points me towards certainty and truth, as opposed to the light of nature, which I never understood what the difference is. Like, oh, the light of nature, like my instincts, but that's different from my abstract thoughts. My instincts are tied to my body and my desires and my drives, but there are things that there are these sort of moments where I just have this epiphany, like, aha, I get it, and that's what he sort of refers to as the light in his soul. So, in a way, even though he's known as a doubter, he's famous for his doubt, Johannes points out, this guy was sincere in his doubt, he was sincere in it. It wasn't just an exercise like it is for a lot of these modern philosophers. They just do it. Well, Descartes did it, didn't he? We got to start where he started. We got to get out of the evil genius thing. How do I know anything? Well, we got to prove that part. How do I know it's not an illusion? How do I know it's not a hologram? How do I know it's not all a lie? Got to prove that. That's the first starting point. He did it with sincerity. I think Johannes is saying the other ones do it as just sort of a method. It's just a method that one does it. That's what moderns do. You got to doubt everything, because that's just what one does. But they all go further, he says. They don't stop at doubt. Skipping forward, he says, this is on the second page, it's actually page 42. Second paragraph. Well, these paragraphs are long. Paragraph's like a page and a half. Second paragraph. He says, today, nobody will stop with faith. They all go further. Okay, so now he's using the same sort of rhetorical flourish there, right? And earlier he said, today everyone is unwilling to stop with doubting, they all go further. Now he says nobody will stop with faith, they all go further. Again, he says, in the olden days, faith was the task of a lifetime. It wasn't the starting point. Doubt was the task of a lifetime. If you were Plato, if you were one of the Greeks, you were like, oh, I know, like obviously this is true, and that's true, and this is true, and all this is true. Let's try to fit together in a system. We've got this system of truth. Oh, wow, it all fit. Wait, it doesn't fit. There's this problem, that problem. Oh, crap. I'm a 70 or 80-year-old man. I got to figure this out. I'm dead. Never figure it out. His whole life to arrive at doubt. Maybe your whole life to arrive at faith. But now it's another thing like doubt, he says, so Hannes says, that's taken for granted, right? Faith is just taken for granted. And people always go further. They don't stop at it. It's not the task of life. It's not the goal, like he's going to argue it was for Abraham, right? For Abraham, once Abraham gets faith, that's enough. Why go further? Where is there to go further to? Faith is the infinite. How do you get beyond the infinite? Right? A relationship to the infinite? Not possible to go beyond that. Not possible to go further. Hegel went further, though. I guess I should mention Hegel. I probably should have mentioned Hegel a lot earlier. Occasionally, you're going to see Johannes da Silentio. I don't know if he ever mentions the guy's name. I haven't read this book, and it's been a few years. And I've only gotten through the first 10 pages, so I'm kind of in the same place y'all are. I don't know if he ever mentions Hegel by name. He might, but he does talk about the system. And he always puts the word system is capitalized. I don't know if that's the translator's doing or if it's in the Danish as well. I know in German, every noun is capitalized, so doesn't really, I don't know, Danish is the same, but it's good that he capitalizes the system because he's referring to Hegel's system. Hegel, very complicated philosopher. Apparently, Hegel once said that, on his deathbed apparently, he said that, how do you put it? He said, only one man ever understood me, and he didn't understand me. So, I think he was talking about himself. But Hegel is seen, at least when he was still alive too, he's one of the rare philosophers that was actually successful while he was still alive. was actually well respected. It didn't have to wait till after his death to be, given accolades. He was very well celebrated by the time he was an old dude. People thought he was brilliant, and they thought that he had pretty much resolved all the problems that Descartes started. So Descartes starts modern philosophy, sort of the framework. It's a focus on knowing, it's a focus on certainty, it's a focus on finding a method that's a good method that ensures certainty and truth. And you get all sorts of philosophical schools that rise up, competing views. Hegel, by many historians and philosophers, is seen as a culmination of all this philosophy. He resolves all these controversies. Like for instance, during the modern period, you had a big debate. Most of the European philosophers on the European continent were what you would call rationalists in approach. Whereas the English speakers, the ones that were philosophizing on the British Isles, they tended to be empiricists. So I don't want to get too much into this. That's not too much history lesson here. But the basic idea is, how does one come to understand things? How does one acquire knowledge? The basic theory for the rationalist is that knowledge is always based on reason. Hence the name rationalism, right? So Descartes was a rationalist. Reason is the basis for knowing, as opposed to the empiricists who think it's experience. It's your experience. You learn from experience. John Locke, kind of famous for his political philosophy, but his epistemology is just as important. John Locke argues that we're born with a blank slate. Our mind is a blank canvas. It's empty. There's nothing in it, right? It's through our experiences, through our senses, that's when we learn things. We hear the word desk, we look at the object and our parents say that's a desk, and we just write it on our little slate, sort of, in our mind, right? So that's the empiricist approach. The rationalist is like, no, it's all based on, perception is deceptive. Sometimes you see optical illusions. Sometimes you think lines are coming together and they meet but they're parallel. You can't rely on your senses. There's all these examples. So these are the two competing views. When you get to Hegel, he looks at all these controversies as just incomplete pictures of truth. Right? That, hey, the empiricist had something going on, the rationalist had something going on, but they left out the full picture. With Hegel, he believes that he has this method called dialectic, which will resolve all these problems. And he does it. Or he thinks he does it. Kierkegaard thinks you can never do this. There's no way to complete the system, says Kierkegaard. If it deals with existence, it can't be systematized. Existence is not final, therefore the system can't be final. But Hegel thinks, no, it can. We use dialectic. We use dialectic to understand how everything fits together. And it gets really complicated. I don't want to get into too much because, like I said, Hegel's a hard philosopher, but it has a lot to do with resolving opposition, right? You've got these two opposing views, but they actually complement one another somehow, says Hegel. And really, you can't understand anything, says Hegel, without understanding its opposite. So you use dialectic to understand how these opposing concepts actually relate to each other. And when you understand how they relate to each other, that brings you to this higher level of understanding. And then you get to the top. And when you get to the top of the sort of this mountain, this pyramid of philosophical speculation, then you understand the system, then you understand what Hegel called absolute spirit, right? You understand spirit, or Geist is the German word, spirit, mind, ghost, usually translated as spirit, right? You understand absolute spirit. That means you understand how everything fits together, right? How all the lower concepts fit together. And for Hegel, absolute spirit took three forms. The highest form was philosophy. Below that was religion and art. So in a way, when you read Johannes and he says they all start with faith, but then they go further, I think that there's sort of a double entendre here. There's two meanings. One, he could also just talk about the fact that a lot of people that just live in Western society are just religious because they just are told to be. They just start with faith, right? Well, what are you? I'm Christian. Why? Oh, because my mom and dad. Like most people are Christian, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, because their parents were. They didn't like read every book and decide, oh, I like this one. This one is true, right? So that's part of it. They all start with faith, and then they go further. Then they extrapolate on that, right? But another thing too is, I think he's even slightly referencing Hegel here, because for Hegel, religion is a lower form of absolute spirit. It's still absolute spirit, which is the highest form of philosophical contemplation. You understand all the lower levels. Philosophy is the highest because it understands everything, how all the sciences fit together, how all the social sciences, the hard sciences fit together, how religions are different. You can compare and contrast religion. Philosophy can comment on art. He likes art and religion, Hegel does. He says they're pretty high up here. They're absolute spirit. If you look at art, what does art represent? Everything. Anything that's a content of anything. You can draw a picture of it, you can make a movie about it, but it's too symbolic, says Hegel. It's too symbolic and it's too subjective. The meaning of art can differ between the observer, whereas religion is more communal, right? The cross and Jesus' sacrifice means something to all Christians, right? The Sunnah, the sayings of Muhammad, they mean the same for all the 5 pillars, all that stuff, right, for Muslims. So it's a more communal, but it's still too abstract. With philosophy, everything becomes more explicit, right? So for Hegel, religion, or what he talks about as faith, is just some sort of philosophical concept that can be understood, it can be speculated on, it can fit into the system, it can all make sense. And all these apparent contradictions and all these apparent arguments amongst philosophers are just misunderstandings. They're just incomplete pictures of the full picture. And this is kind of, you could say, a very optimistic interpretation of the history of philosophy. I get a lot of frustration from students when I teach my intro class, because a lot of times by the end of the semester, they're like, what the heck is right? We learn Plato, and then we learn this other guy that demolishes Plato, and then we learn another guy that demolishes that guy. It's like every century you get a new philosopher that shows why the other guy before him was wrong. Maybe that has to do with the way I teach the class, because I kind of pick philosophers that are distinct. But it's easy to read it that way. But for Hegel, he's like, no, that was just apparent, It seems like we throw everything away and start over, but really it builds off the past. And there's progress, and every absolute spirit gets more and fully worked out. Everything kind of works out in the end, and we once we do philosophy, we talk about it, we see how it all fits together. It all works. Hegel was sort of Kierkegaard's enemy, right? Kierkegaard is like, this guy is wrong. He's wrong about this. I think I gave this example last time, but it wasn't in reference to Hegel. I should have given Hegel a little credit for this, though. But for Hegel, you can reduce the concept of fatherhood, for instance. He writes about fatherhood in, I think, the philosophy of right. It fits right into a system. When you talk about, first you have contract rights, then you have family obligations. And so all these concepts fit together and lead to one another, right? But for him, fatherhood is a universal. And it's something that, if you understand fatherhood and the universal concept, you can understand anybody's relation to their father. For Kierkegaard, Hegel is crazy. He's off his rocker. Every relationship is unique, right? There might be things about your relationship to your father that are universal, that is true of, okay, he's the male who was a part of my procreation, of birthing me, right? He's the male ingredient of spawning me, right? That might be, but what does father mean to you? What is that concept? What is a dad? What is a good dad? What is a bad dad? What was your dad like, right? These are all unique to the individual. they can't be reduced to some universal concept that is true in every case. And so for Kierkegaard, this is something that Hegel and really all philosophers miss. Existence as we live it, and as we fulfill ourselves or try to fulfill ourselves, can't be encapsulated in some system like Hegel wants it to be. Faith, religion, doesn't fit. In fact, for him, faith is something beyond what he calls the ethical, beyond the system, beyond anything we can explain. Just like, again, your relationship to your father, your mother, whoever, your brother, sister, whatever, they're all unique. And your relationship to God, too, when we get to faith, always going to be unique. This is another reason why Kierkegaard is so critical of organized religion. He's hyper-Protestant. Like, he doesn't even like most of the Protestant churches because they're not Protestant enough. He's like hyper-individual. He's like, look, there's no formula for how you relate to the deity. I think when you get to his example of what he calls the Knight of Faith, the guy does go to church, but that's not essential, right? Like, yeah, he goes to church, but that's not his faith, right? He just does that because that's a part of what he does. He's a community thing. But his faith is something deeper. It's something much more personal. Let me try to finish this preface here before I run out of time. I want to get to the attunement section. So he says, today nobody will stop at faith, they all go further. It would perhaps be rash to inquire where to, but surely a mark of urbanity and good breeding on my part to assume that in fact everyone does indeed have faith. Otherwise it would be odd to talk of going further. In those old days it was different. For then faith was a task for a whole lifetime, not a skill thought to be acquired in either days or weeks. When the old campaigner, right, the person who's going on a crusade back in the medieval times, when an old campaigner approached the end, had fought the good fight and kept his faith, his heart was still young enough not to have forgotten the fear and trembling that disciplined his youth, and which, although the grown man mastered it, no man altogether outgrows, unless he somehow manages at the earliest possible opportunity to go further. Where these venerable figures arrived at, our age just begins in order to go further. He's kind of, I think, mocking our age here. And he's harkening back, kind of romanticizing a past when a campaigner, some knight who went off to fight the holy war, like, not really. He thought he was high. He thought he was. He was probably just doing it for the king. But, this is, like he says, something that he kept his faith, his heart was still young enough to not have forgotten the fear and trembling that disciplined his youth, in which, although the grown man mastered it, no man altogether outgrows. Fear and trembling, the name of the title of this work. Faith is only arrived at through this process, right? So this man of faith remembers that walk up the hill to sacrifice Isaac, remembers that moment when all was lost, and when everything was encapsulated in that moment. What is it that I care about? What is it that my life is? What is my purpose? What matters and what doesn't? That's always going to be with him wherever he goes. He's going to carry that with him. That's faith. The present author is no philosopher. He has not understood the system, right? Hegel. He's not understood the system, nor does he know if there really is one, if it has been completed. As far as his own weak head is concerned, the thought of what huge heads everyone must have in order to have such huge thoughts is already enough. Even if one were to render the whole content of faith into conceptual form, it would not follow that one had grasped faith, grasped how one came to it and how it came to one. Again, we can't explain faith in some system. And the story of Abraham is supposed to be instructive, right? Try to understand it. Try to make sense of it. You're doing violence to it. You're sugarcoating it if you do. If you're honest about it, it doesn't make sense. But yeah, it's faith, right? And he's going to try to make as much sense of it, I guess, as he can. He says the present author is no philosopher. He is poetici elegante, right? Or, to put it in a poetic way, well-chosen terms, right? He's poetic and elegant. This, I'm glad I read that passage. Reminds me, and this edition, I like it because it's literary, but it kind of sucks because it doesn't give you the subtitle. But this, oh, it does. I was about to dog it. The subtitle here, and you don't have it on the PDF file, is Fear and Trembling, Dialectical Lyric by Johannes de Silencio. So Fear and Trembling is a dialectical lyric. That's a paradox, right? Or, sort of inconsistent, contradictory. A dialectic, right? This is, again, kind of a reference to Hegel. Hegel used this term dialectic to describe his method, how he understood concepts by their opposites and how their opposites sort of resolved into higher concepts. That, really the word dialectic, it's an old word. It goes way back to even the Greeks, to Plato. And for them, it basically means that you're reasoning towards the truth, right? You're basically trying to understand things. It's almost like a debate in your head, but a debate is a thing that people do against each other and try to win. A dialectic is a process by which we examine ideas, we examine pros and cons, this side, that side, and we try to arrive at a fuller version of the truth through bouncing ideas off of each other. That's the traditional dialectic. For Hegel, it's got a more technical meaning, right? For him, dialectic is the method he uses to understand concepts and how they relate to each other, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless of how you understand it, it's a philosophical approach. It's a rational approach. A lyrical. What is that? What's a lyric? Something's lyrical. What are lyrics?
Music.
Yes, words to the song, right? It's poetic. It's creative, right? Metaphorical. So it's a rational poem, I guess, right? A scientific poem or something like that, or song or something like that. Again, it's sort of a contradictory subtitle in a way. So he's like, look, I can't understand faith philosophically, right? You can't grasp it like that. So I'm going to try to, but I'm going to have to use a little elegance and poetry. So the present author's no philosopher. He's poetic and elegant, a freelance who neither writes the system nor makes any promises about the system. He pledges neither anything about the system nor himself to it. He writes because for him doing so is a luxury. The more agreeable and conspicuous, the fewer who buy and read what he writes. In an age where passion has been done away with for the sake of science, he easily foresees his fate. In an age where an author who wants readers must be careful to write in a way that he can be comfortably leafed through during the after-dinner nap, and be sure to present himself to the world like the polite gardener's boy in The Advertiser, who hat in hand and with good references from his previous place of employment recommends himself to the much esteemed public. He foresees his fate will be to be completely ignored, has a dreadful foreboding that the scourge of zealous criticism will more than once make itself felt, and shudders at what terrifies him even more, that some enterprising recorder, a paragraph swallower, who to rescue learning is always willing to do to others' writings what to preserve good taste, Trope nobly did to the destruction of the human race. He will slice him into sections as ruthlessly as the man who in the service of the science of punctuation divided up his speech by counting the words and putting a full stop after every 50 and a semicolon after every 35. No, I prostrate myself before any systematic bag searcher. This is not the system. It hasn't the slightest thing to do with the system. I wish all good on the system and on the Danish shareholders in that omnibus, for it will hardly become a tower. I think he's kind of referring there to the Bible, the tower, leaning tower of, so the Tower of Babel, right? What's the story about Babel, right? They tried to build a tower so high that it could reach heaven. And God's like, you can't build a tower so high, you reach heaven. And he scattered them all, confused their language, right? Scattered them amongst the earth, right? I think that's a reference to Tower of Babel, but anyway. I wish them good luck and prosperity, one and all. Respectfully, Johannes Disciples. Now this next section, let me get some room up here on the board and see how much time we got left. What time is this class supposed to end? 45. Okay, cool, good. All right, well, just about good. I don't think we're gonna get through all these attunements. We'll probably get through maybe the first two, but first off, let me ask you guys, what is the word attunement? What does it mean to be attuned? Attunement.
Be aware and understand.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, right. I was kind of thinking in musical terms, but the way you put it's probably better, because that's kind of more his. I think if you attune something, you're kind of getting instruments to sort of agree with each other, right? You know, like you ever go see a symphony, does the keyboard come out there, the pianist, and they don't play the C. What do they play? Who's a musician? Yeah, they play like an F chord or something like that. So the rest of the symphony can tune themselves to that, to the acoustics of the environment or whatever, right? But the way you put it's better, because that's really what he's doing here. He's trying to get an understanding of what? What is he trying to become attuned to? Johannes.
Abraham's faith.
Right. The story of Abraham and what it meant, right? What does it really mean to have faith? If that story of Abraham is supposed to be the story of faith, then what the heck is faith? And how do I make sense of this? And so that's what he tries to do. And we read the passage from the Bible last time, so we won't have to worry about going over that. But I recommend, reading it, go back to that. What did I say? Was it chapter 29 or chapter 22? I think it's chapter 29 in Genesis, right? But yeah, I'd read that a couple times and kind of to see, what he's doing here, because there's a lot of references to that very short section. But he writes, and I think he's writing about himself. He's Mr. Poetic, so he's got to be mysterious, right? But I think he's writing about himself when he says, there was once a man. Right? He says, there was once a man. He had learned as a child that beautiful tale of how God tried Abraham, how he withstood the test, kept his faith, and for the second time received a son against every expectation, right? I guess the second time. He thought he was going to lose Isaac. He gets to keep him, so he gets him back again, right? When he became older, he read the same story with even greater admiration, for life had divided what had been united in the child's pious simplicity. So this is one, again, remember the preface, faith is a task of a lifetime. He's kind of showing this. Look, when I read this as a kid, okay, mommy, daddy, that's Abraham. Oh, that's what he did. Wait a minute, Abraham's gonna kill his son? Like the more he thinks about it, like the harder it is to deal with it. The harder it is for him to understand. Right? The older he became, the more often his thoughts turned to that tale. His enthusiasm became stronger and stronger. And yet less and less could he understand it. Finally, it put everything else out of his mind. His soul had but one wish, actually to see Abraham. And one longing, to have been witness to those events. It was not the beautiful regions of the East, nor the earthly splendor of the promised land he longed to see. Not the God-fearing couple whose old age God had blessed, right? Remember, if you've read that Bible, Isaac isn't born till I think Sarah's like in her 90s or, and when God tells them they're gonna have a son, they laugh. They're like, good joke, right? Yeah, Sarah's gonna have a kid, right? Right? Not the God-fearing couple whose old age God had blessed, not the venerable figure of the patriarch stricken in years, not the youthful vigor God gave to Isaac. It would have been the same if it had taken place on a barren heath. What he yearned for, right? What this man wanted to see was to accompany them on that 3-day journey when Abraham rode with grief before him and Isaac by his side. He wanted to be there at that moment when Abraham raised his eyes and saw in the distance the mountain in Moriah. The moment he left the asses behind and went up on the mountain alone with Isaac. For what occupied him was not the finely wrought fabric of imagination, but the shudder of thought. I don't know how much I want to dwell on that last statement, but that's an interesting distinction, right? He's saying that when he's contemplating Abraham, what really disturbs him is not the finely wrought fabric of imagination, but what he calls the shudder of thought. So this distinction between imagination and thought. this man was no thinker, he felt no need to go further than faith. To be remembered as its father seemed to him to be surely the greatest glory of all, and to have it a lot to be envied even if no one else knew. This man was no learned exegete, right? An exegesis is like an explanation of a spiritual text. He was not an exegete. He knew no Hebrew. Had he known Hebrew, then perhaps it might have been easy for him to understand the story of Abraham. And then we get into these sections, right? He's got 4 different sections. And these, I want to think, are ways he's trying to make sense of this story. And they're definitely different versions than the one that you read in the Bible or the Quran. Yeah, the Quran. Oh, for the Quran, I think it's not Isaac, but Ishmael, who's the kid, right? Who's same story, right? Any Muslims in here, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong on that. Pretty sure it's, anyway. All right, let's read the first, like I said, we probably have time for like the first 2 interpretations, then we'll have to cut it today and finish these next class. But this is the first interpretation. They all begin, no they don't. The first one begins with an epigram. And so he says, and it came to pass after these things, this is a quote from the Bible, it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah. Offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And then here we go, right? So this is the first attunement. This is the first reading. Mr. Johannes de Silencio is trying to imagine this episode. It was early morning. Abraham rose in good time, had the asses saddled, and left his tent, taking Isaac with him. But Sarah watched them from the window as they went down the valley, until she could see them no more. They rode in silence for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th, Abraham still said not a word, but raised his eyes and saw afar the mountain in Moriah. He left the lads behind and went on alone up the mountain with Isaac beside him. But Abraham said to himself, I won't conceal from Isaac where this way is leading him. He stood still, laid his hand on Isaac's head to give him a blessing, and Isaac bent down to receive it. And Abraham's expression was fatherly, his gaze gentle, his speech encouraging. But Isaac could not understand him. His soul could not be uplifted. He clung to Abraham's knees, pleaded at his feet, begged for his young life, for his fair promise. He called to mind the joy in Abraham's house, reminded him of the sorrow and loneliness. Then Abraham lifted the boy up and walked with him, taking him by the hand, and his words were full of comfort and exhortation. But Isaac could not understand him. Abraham climbed the mountain in Moriah, but Isaac did not understand him. Then he turned away from Isaac for a moment, but when Isaac saw his face a second time, it was changed. His gaze was wild. His mien of horror is one of horror. He caught Isaac by the chest, threw him to the ground, and said, Foolish boy, do you believe I'm your father? I am an idolater. Do you believe this is God's command? No, it is my desire. Then Isaac trembled and in his anguish cried, God in heaven, have mercy on me. God of Abraham, have mercy on me. If I have no father on earth, then be thou my father. But below his breath, Abraham said to himself, Lord in heaven, I thank thee. It is after all better that he believe I am a monster than that he lose faith in thee. When the child is weaned, this is an interesting metaphor. He seems to end every attunement with a metaphor. He says, when the child is weaned, is to be weaned from the mother blackens her breast, just like Abraham, I guess, blackened, made himself look crazy. It's not God, I'm just nuts, I'm a demon. He didn't want his son to blame it on God, so he took the fall, right? The mother blackens her breast, for it would be a shame were the breast to look pleasing when the child is not to have it. So the child believes that the breast has changed, but the mother is the same. Her look loving and tender as ever. Lucky the one that needed no more terrible means to wean the child. So this is the one where, I guess, your interpretation is welcome as well. He's trying to understand it in terms of how the heck is Isaac going to live with his dad, right? And how is Abraham going to try to explain it to his son? Right? And so there's only one way. I'm nuts. I don't want you to be a blasphemer. If you found out that God wanted me to kill you, you might blame God and think he's kind of weird and messed up. But I just know this is the right thing. I got faith. So I'm sort of he's protecting his son. He's sheltering his son, right? By taking the fall, right? By playing the bad guy or something like that.
It kind of shows he doesn't really have faith.
That's it, right? Yeah, cool. I was gonna wait, but yeah, you got it. No. I think that's the point. I think that's kind of the point of all of them. I could be wrong though, so I was kind of waiting, but because I didn't want to inform your reading, but I think that's like they all kind of make sense, but they're not faith, right? They're all like he's trying to bridge a gap between his consciousness and the son's, and to explain it, and that's not possible, right? Says John. So he has to be silent. That's why he's Johannes the Silencio. All right, we got time for the second one. Let's do the second one, and then we'll do 3 and 4 on Wednesday. So the second one, it was early morning. Abraham rode in good time, embraced Sarah, the bride of his old age, and Sarah kissed Isaac, who had taken her disgrace from her. Was her pride and hope for all generations, right? Because she couldn't get pregnant forever, and finally had him, right? So they rode on in silence, and Abraham's eyes were fixed on the ground until the 4th day when he looked up and saw afar the mountain in Moriah. But he turned his gaze once again to the ground. He silently arranged the firewood, bound Isaac, silently drew the knife. Then he saw the ram that God had appointed. He sacrificed that and returned home. From that day on, Abraham became old. He could not forget that God had demanded this of him. Isaac throve as before, but Abraham's eye was darkened. He saw joy no more. And then he says, when the child has grown and is to be weaned, the mother virginally covers her breast, so the child no more has a mother. Lucky the child that lost its mother in no other way. What's going on in this one? This one's not as clear, I think. It almost seems like, well, he did it. He did what he was supposed to do. Like, he just went up there and did the deed, got the ram, and what's the difference? The mother virginally covers her breast. So the kid's still trying to suck on it, but it don't work, right? Because she's covering it with the cloth. What's the difference between breastfeeding with your nipple or breastfeeding with cloth over your nipple and the baby trying to suck through your cloth? Yeah, the one works, one doesn't. One is actually breastfeeding, the other just looks like breastfeeding, and it really isn't. So I think and again, your reading might be as good as mine, but what I take the second one to be is, it was all just window dressing. He went through the motions, but his heart wasn't in it. Like, yeah, he went on the mountain, he got the ram, he did the thing, and Isaac thrived and all that, but like, it wasn't through faith. It was he was telling himself in his head everything's gonna be fine, and kind of rationalizing it to himself. And so you're gonna see later when we get to the Problemata, he uses a lot of metaphors, and there's a metaphor of swimming versus making the same movements of a swimmer while you're being suspended. What's the difference? They're the same, their bodies are moving the same, they're going through the motions, but the swimmer's actually swimming. They're in water. The other person's just hanging from, the ceiling on suspenders and making swimming movements. So that's what I think the second one is. He's going through the motions, but it's like, oh, it's a duty. It's like God's, it's not as intense. It's not the faith. It's still the ethical approach. Right?
So did Abraham kill Isaac?
No, in the Bible, no. In the Bible, he gets to the top of the mountain. He's got the freaking Caravaggio painting here, freaking crazy looking. I've actually seen the painting in Uffizi. Look at Isaac, that's Isaac's face, The full picture's on the back, but you've got Abraham's got him on the stone, about to slice his throat. And then all of a sudden an angel appears and says, stop. And he's like, oh, okay. He's like, there was a test, pass the test, sacrifice this ram instead. And he gives him a ram. He sacrifices that instead. But that's usually the excuse you get from Christians. Oh, it was a test. It was just a test. It was a test. Did he know it was a test? No. If he did, then it wouldn't be faith. Right? It wouldn't be faith. So that's what he's trying to reconcile here. And he's trying to do it with the attunement. He's like, well, maybe Abraham like pretended it was him that wanted to do it so that he didn't make God look bad to the son. You know, that's sort of the first version, I think. The mother's breast is blackened. This one with the mother's breast is covered with cloth, it's like he didn't really do it. It's sort of, it was just a going through the motions thing. Right? But that's sort of how I read the second one. But
It's like an anti-hero.
in a way, yeah, well, I know why you would say that, but we got to be careful because Kierkegaard actually in a lot of it, I don't think, actually he does in the praise and speech and praise of Abraham. He talks about the speech maker for the hero and the poet and all that stuff. I say in a way, Abraham is a hero, but not in the traditional like medieval knight, like saving the fair maiden from the dragon type hero, right? Because a hero is somebody who, like, he does something that we all need, and he kind of helps society, and he sort of sacrifices himself for, you know. Whereas the faith, the figure of faith, does make this sacrifice, does make this sort of leap, and in a way, I guess it does have a sort of use. I don't know, maybe that's debatable. You could say a use in the context of society, but it's not something that's supposed to be understood. Right? Like, again, you can't get it the way you get the hero. And we're not going to get far enough in this, but if you read the whole book in, I think, the Problemata 2, he goes through all these stories like Greek myths and stories of like the fair knight and like King Arthur. And he talks about how those aren't fate. They're different. They're heroes because they can be explained in somewhat universalistic terms that sort of is I guess safe for the community, whereas like Abraham is doing stuff that you could never really justify completely, right? Like what are you gonna just say, well, you know, God told me to murder my son, so Abraham did it, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and do it too, right? I mean, it's happened before. Who was that lady? She was in Spring, I think. Yates, yeah, I always forget her name. Andrea Yates, yeah. How many of her kids? 9 kids drowned to death in a bathtub because God told her to do it, is what she said. Right.
Postpartum depression.
What's that?
Postpartum
depression, yeah. Yeah, so this is the one that to me that scares me about Kierkegaard. You know, like I love this book, I think it's fascinating, but I'm like, dude, you're basically saying like once you found your faith, like anything's like pretty much on the table. You know, and he kind of admits that though. He's sort of like, it doesn't make sense. He's like, but when you, like, let's say, you know, for Abraham, it's Isaac and being the father of many nations. But let's say that for you, faith is your love of whoever you're, like, you're married and your wife, and that's the one thing in your life that all other things get value from. That's the center of your world, right? For Kierkegaard, if that's your form of faith, marital love or whatever, or maybe you're an artist and you're just really passionate about your art, you do things for that can't be justified. Right? So you will murder. I'll murder for that woman. I love her so much. You know what I mean? I know it's wrong. But I would still do it because I love her that much. Whatever, right? So, I don't even feel that way about somebody else, but you know, like, I've seen movies, you know, like, I don't know, that was real life. Like, that's kind of scary to me, you know, like, I kill for you. It's like, geez, like, am I that great? You know, what the heck? Yeah, thanks. I know I'm pretty hot. Jeez. But yeah, so you've got this thing that you will do things that are completely unjustifiable, but because that is that important to you, right? That your whole life sort of centers around that one thing. And another part of this that I think is kind of weak, we're not going to read it, but he tries to defend himself against like sort of my concerns. At the end of this book, there's a section on what he calls the demonic, and he tries to distinguish that from faith. You know, because he realizes he's like, people are gonna read this and be like, so you're basically saying like anything as long as like I know God's talking to me, and you know, it's like, you know, it's just my task, you know. It's like, no, but to be honest with you, it's been a while since I read that section, but I've read it several times, and it's kind of like, it's super vague. It's kind of like, I don't see really the big difference between what you're calling the demonic and the knight of faith. They both seem to be just stubborn and passionate people, right? And who's to know that this one's doing a thing that's really good for themselves, whereas this one's doing something demonic, and yeah. Well, I'm rambling on, and we're almost out of time, so I that's a good place to stop. Like I said, for next time, we didn't finish attunement. We'll get through that pretty quick, though, because we've only got 2 more sections to go. But yeah, for next class, read that speech in praise of Abraham, and try to get started on the Problemata, right? The preamble from the heart. So that'll be for Wednesday, right? We'll be on Zoom. And next week is a short week, right? It's Labor Day, so we're only meeting one day, and it's online. So that'll be pretty light, I guess. So yeah, that's the assignment. Y'all are dismissed.